The mahogany doors of the Suffolk County family courtroom swung shut with a muffled, almost funereal thud. Ethan Vance remained seated, the polished oak of the defendant's table cold beneath his hands. Outside, the Boston wind howled a familiar, miserable tune, mirroring the hollow ache in his chest. His attorney, a sharp, 50-something woman named Victoria Sterling, leaned in, her voice a low, gravelly whisper meant only for him. "They've done their job, Ethan. They've painted you as the callous, emotionally bankrupt Brahmin who bought himself a trophy wife and then tossed her aside. $80 million is a staggering figure, even in this court." Ethan didn't flinch, but the words were a physical blow. Callous, emotionally bankrupt. He ran a thumb over the silver signet ring, the Vance crest, a silent anchor to the world Olivia was determined to wrest from him. It wasn't the $80 million that wounded him. It was the insidious erosion of his name and the imminent threat to the heritage. The estate, a sprawling New England ranch nestled on the North Shore, was more than property. It was a testament to 4 generations of Vances, a living archive he was failing to protect. "The heritage is non-negotiable, Victoria," he stated, his voice flat. "She can have the Manhattan penthouse, the Aspen chalet, even the damn yacht, but not the land." Victoria sighed, adjusting her Dior jacket. "Olivia is asking for the estate, Ethan. That's her opening move, her leveraging tactic. She knows how much it means to you, and her legal team is ruthless. They've successfully used those social media posts, her soliloquies of sorrow, to bias the public. The judge is trying to stay impartial, but public opinion has a weight of its own." He looked away, his mind drifting back 10 years. He'd met Olivia Dubois at a charity gala in Miami. She was electrifying, a vision in crimson silk, an artist with fierce dark eyes and a laugh that promised recklessness. Ethan, then reeling from the quiet trauma of his mother's decline and death, had been captivated by her vibrancy. She was the antidote to the staid, emotionally constipated world of the Vances. He'd mistaken passion for love, confusing profound loneliness for true connection. He'd wanted to be saved, and Olivia had wanted to ascend. "It was never about love, was it?" he murmured, more to himself than to his lawyer. "It was about arrangement." "Ethan," Victoria corrected sharply, "and arrangements, when they fail, are about assets. Go home. Prepare yourself. Your next deposition is grueling." He left the courthouse, dodging the cluster of photographers and a lone, aggressive journalist shouting questions about marital cruelty. The city felt suffocating, its modern gleam hiding too many secrets. Ethan drove his black Range Rover not to his sleek Back Bay condo, but straight out of Boston, toward the salt marshes and the ancient elms of the North Shore. The heritage stood sentinel against the failing light, a stone manor both beautiful and foreboding. He pulled into the drive, the tires crunching on gravel that felt suddenly too loud. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, a rhythmic, judgmental sound. He walked into the library, his father's old sanctum, and poured a scotch. The room smelled of leather and age and unspoken duty. He sank into an armchair, staring at a framed portrait of his mother, Clara Vance. Her eyes, usually so sharp and knowing, looked strangely veiled in the photo, taken perhaps a year before she passed. A wave of guilt washed over him. He knew the rift in his marriage had started with him. The affair with Clara, the interior designer, had been a momentary lapse, a desperate grab for human warmth when his home life had become a sterile performance. He'd confessed it to Olivia a year ago, believing it was the only way to salvage honesty. Instead, she had filed for divorce 3 days later, her claims instantly escalating from a simple division of assets to the scorched earth demand of $80 million and the entire ranch. She hadn't been heartbroken, she had been given a weapon. The darkness outside thickened. He heard the distinct click-clack of high heels on the marble floor. Olivia, she was still living in the house, a calculated move to assert co-ownership and provoke him. She appeared in the doorway, breathtaking and glacial, wearing a silk dressing gown the color of deep-sea ice. "Leaving so soon, Ethan? The court seemed rather stimulating today." Her voice was laced with an aristocratic detachment she'd carefully cultivated over the past decade. "The house is cold, Olivia. You could turn up the heat." I enjoy the chill. It makes me feel alive. Besides, I am conserving the estate's funds, which, by the way, will soon be my funds. She walked into the library, pouring herself a glass of the vintage Madeira he kept locked away. You're mistaken if you think the judge will grant you all of this. You signed a prenuptial agreement. A cruel smile touched her lips, a brief, sharp flash. Oh, the prenup. It had clauses, Ethan. Vague ones regarding emotional support and marital duties. Duties I meticulously performed, even as you were sharing your little secrets with a contractor on Nantucket. She took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving his. I know you. You crave the respect of your dead mother and the old guard. Losing the heritage isn't losing money. It's losing your soul. And I intend to take it, piece by excruciating piece. Ethan felt a deep, chilling conviction set in. She wasn't just fighting for money, she was fighting to obliterate him. He stood up, his tall frame towering over her. The years of emotional withdrawal and mutual dishonesty had culminated in this toxic theater. You won't win, Olivia, not because I'm richer, but because you overestimate the power of your lies. This family has survived worse than you. Oh, darling, she purred, tracing the rim of her glass with a perfect nail. Every family has a secret, and mine is that I'm better at this game than you. I will not leave this house, not until I sign the papers transferring the title. You can sleep in your sterile little condo in Back Bay. The heritage is mine now. She turned her back and walked away, her silk gown whispering against the marble, leaving Ethan alone in the vast, echoing library, the weight of his family's inheritance pressing down on him, forcing him to acknowledge that the only way out of this might be to reveal a truth far uglier than mere adultery. The morning light in Boston was unforgiving. It cut through the floor-to-ceiling glass of Victoria Sterling's office on the 42nd floor of the Prudential Tower, illuminating dust motes dancing in the sterile air and casting long, sharp shadows across the mahogany conference table. Ethan sat opposite his lawyer, a cooling cup of black coffee between his hands. He felt a phantom hangover, not from alcohol, but from the confrontation with Olivia the night before. Her words, "Every family has a secret," echoed in the silence of the room, competing with the low hum of the building's ventilation. Victoria slid a thin manila folder across the polished surface. The friction of paper on wood sounded like a dry cough. We've been digging into the trust, specifically the ancillary accounts attached to your mother's medical expenses, Victoria said, her voice devoid of judgment, purely clinical. Forensic accounting is tedious work, Ethan, but it usually yields inconsistencies. Look at the third page. Ethan opened the folder. Columns of numbers blurred before his eyes until he focused on the highlighted rows. Transfers. Small at first, then escalating. 5,000, 12,000, 50,000, all dated 18 months ago. The dates, Victoria prompted, tapping the page with a Mont Blanc pen. Look at the signature authorization. Ethan squinted. The signature was looped, elegant, and sharp. Olivia Vance. Underneath, in typed print, was a title he had never authorized. Designated primary caretaker and financial proxy. I don't understand, Ethan said, his brow furrowing. Mother had nurses. We had a firm handling the bills. Olivia visited, yes, but she wasn't a caretaker. According to this addendum filed with the bank, she was. And these withdrawals coincide perfectly with the weeks your mother's condition deteriorated rapidly. Victoria leaned back, studying him. Where were you in November of that year, Ethan? The question acted as a hook, dragging him backward through time, away from the sterile office and into the salt spray air of Nantucket. November. The memory washed over him, gray and melancholic. He had retreated to the island to oversee the renovation of a smaller family property, a cottage on the bluffs that he intended to sell. He told himself it was business, but in truth, he was fleeing the suffocation of his marriage. Olivia had been consumed by the gala season in Boston, her ambition a frantic energy that exhausted him. In Nantucket, the wind whipped through the skeleton of the cottage, carrying the scent of pine and wet sand. That was where he met her, Clara. Not his mother, though the shared name struck him with a pang of irony that felt almost Freudian. But the interior architect hired for the project. She was 29, with messy hair always tied back with a pencil and hands that were rough from handling timber and stone. They had spent days reviewing blueprints in the unheated sunroom, their breath misting in the cold air. It hadn't started with a touch. It started with a silence. One afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the ocean into a bruise of purple and black, Clara had looked up from the plans. She didn't ask about the budget or the timeline. "You look like you're holding your breath," she had said quietly, "even when you exhale." Ethan had stared at her, stunned. For 10 years, Olivia had looked at him and seen a checkbook, a pedigree, a stepping stone. Clara saw a man drowning. The affair began 2 days later, during a storm that grounded the ferries. It wasn't the frantic, cinematic passion of movies. It was slow, desperate, and deeply comforting. In her small rented apartment above a bakery, surrounded by sketches and the smell of cinnamon, Ethan found a version of himself he thought had died. He wasn't the Vance heir there. He was just Ethan. "I shouldn't be here," he had whispered into the dark of her bedroom, the guilt already gnawing at the edges of his relief. "But you are," Clara had replied, tracing the line of his jaw, "because there's nothing for you back there." He had stayed for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of living a lie that felt more honest than his truth. And while he was there, wrapped in the illicit warmth of another woman, his phone had remained largely silent. Olivia hadn't called to check on him. He assumed she was busy with her social climbing. Back in the office, Ethan blinked, the gray ocean of Nantucket replaced by the steel skyline of Boston. A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. The dates on the bank statement Victoria was pointing at, November 12th through November 30th, aligned perfectly with his time on the island. "I was away," Ethan said, his voice raspy. "I was in Nantucket, working." "And while you were working," Victoria said, her eyes narrowing slightly, sensing the omission, "Olivia effectively took control of your mother's liquidity. These funds were marked for specialized treatments that, as far as we can tell, were never administered. But the more concerning part is the authority. To get this level of access, your mother would have had to sign off on it while being of sound mind." "Was she?" Ethan felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. "No, she was drifting. The dementia was intermittent, but the doctor said she was vulnerable. I was the power of attorney. I never signed this delegation." He picked up the paper, his hand trembling slightly. The realization was a physical weight. While he was betraying Olivia with his body and heart, seeking solace from his loneliness, Olivia had been busy too. But her betrayal wasn't emotional. It was calculated, bureaucratic, and cold. She had used his absence, the very absence created by his infidelity, to isolate his mother. "She knew," Ethan whispered. The thought was horrifying. "She knew I was checked out. She might not have known about the affair specifically, but she knew I wasn't watching. She used my neglect as a cover to insert herself." Victoria nodded slowly. "It's a possibility, but there's something else. The date of the final transfer. December 2nd. Ethan froze. "Mother died on December 4th. Exactly. 2 days before cardiac arrest. A transfer of $250,000 to a Shell LLC registered in Delaware. The company dissolves 3 months later. Money gone." Victoria closed the folder. "This isn't just a divorce anymore, Ethan. This looks like fraud. And depending on what she did as caretaker to secure those signatures, we might be looking at elder abuse." Ethan stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the ant-like cars crawling through the city streets. The guilt of his affair with the architect suddenly felt different. It wasn't just a moral failing. It was the tactical error that had left the gate unguarded. He had been so consumed by his own emotional void that he hadn't seen the predator circling the one person he was supposed to protect. "She claimed in court yesterday that she was the only one who cared for Mother in the end," Ethan said, his reflection in the glass looking ghostly pale. "That I was absent. She's using her crime as her alibi." "It's a common strategy," Victoria replied, packing the documents. "Gaslight the narrative. But now we have a thread. The question is, are you willing to pull it? If we accuse her of this, the press will go feral, and she will retaliate with everything she has on you, including whatever happened in Nantucket. Ethan turned back to her. The image of the architect Clara, warm, soft, safe, faded, replaced by the image of his mother, frail and confused in her final days, with Olivia smiling by her bedside, a pen in hand. "Pull it," Ethan said, his voice hard as stone. "Pull the whole damn thing down." The elevator ride down was a blur, but as Ethan stepped out into the biting cold of the street, his phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. He opened it. It was a photo. A grainy, zoomed-in shot of him and the architect, Clara, walking hand in hand on a desolate Nantucket beach. Below it, a simple caption. "I have documents too." Ethan stared at the screen, the traffic noise fading into a dull roar. Olivia wasn't just defending herself, she was hunting, and she had been watching him long before he ever suspected a thing. Ethan sat in his parked car at the edge of the Boston Common, the engine idling, the heater fighting a losing battle against the encroaching frost. The threatening text message with the photo of him and the architect was still burning a hole in his digital consciousness, but he forced himself to lock the phone screen. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he picked up his tablet and did something Victoria had explicitly advised against. He opened Olivia's Instagram profile. It was a masterclass in curated vulnerability. The latest post, uploaded just 2 hours ago, was a black and white photograph taken inside the Heritage. It showed the long, empty hallway leading to the master suite, shadows stretching like skeletal fingers across the floor. In the foreground, Olivia's hand rested on the banister, her wedding ring catching a singular, melancholic ray of light. The caption was brief, poetic, and devastating. Echoes of a promise kept alone, protecting the legacy he left behind, even when the silence is deafening. Heritage, rare resilience. Ethan scrolled through the comments. There were hundreds of them. "Stay strong, Olivia. He doesn't deserve your loyalty. Typical trust fund behavior, abandoning the wife who built him up." She wasn't just fighting him in court, she was dismantling his character in the public square, leveraging the very modern weapon of victimhood against the archaic silence of the Vance family code. Olivia knew that the Boston elite, the Brahmins, the charity board directors, the hushed voices at the Somerset Club, would never publicly comment, but they were watching, and she was giving them a show. Ethan knew the source of this hunger. Olivia hadn't been born into this world of muted colors and old money. She came from a working-class neighborhood in Revere, the daughter of a shift manager and a school nurse. There was no shame in that, but Olivia had always treated her origins like a stain to be scrubbed out. For 10 years, she had studied the Vances like an anthropologist studying a dying tribe. She mimicked their accent, their dress, their disdain for the ostentatious. But deep down, the insecurity festered. She believed that by acquiring the objects, the house, the art, the name, she could finally transmute herself into one of them. And Ethan, in his emotional absenteeism, had given her the perfect opening. He drove back to the estate, the sky turning the color of a bruised plum. When he entered the Heritage, the silence was heavy, almost pressurized. Olivia was nowhere to be seen, likely sequestered in the West Wing, plotting her next digital strike. Ethan moved instinctively toward the one room that still felt like neutral ground. His mother's private sitting room, the Blue Room. It had been sealed off since Clara Vance's death, preserved like a museum exhibit. The air inside was stale, smelling of dried lavender and dust. Ethan walked in, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. Everything was exactly as his mother had left it. Her reading glasses on the side table, a half-finished embroidery hoop, the stack of Architectural Digest magazines. But as he moved closer to the hearth, something felt wrong. The fireplace, an ornate marble structure, was usually cleaned weekly by the housekeeping staff. Yet deep in the corner of the grate, tucked behind a pristine birch log, was a cluster of gray ash and a singular, jagged scrap of glossy paper that had survived the flames. Ethan knelt, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached in, soot coating his fingertips, and pulled out the fragment. It was the corner of a photograph. He recognized it instantly. It was from the Christmas party 4 years ago. The last Christmas before his mother's mind began to truly fracture. He remembered the original image clearly. It was of him, his mother, and Olivia standing in front of the great tree. In the photo, his mother had been laughing, her hand resting affectionately on Ethan's arm. But the scrap in his hand only showed his mother. The edge where his arm should have been was ripped, not burned. The tear was jagged and violent. He looked closer at the ash in the grate. There were other scraps. He sifted through them, frantically, piecing together the debris. He found Olivia's face, perfectly preserved. He found his mother's face. But his own face, his image, was gone. It had been shredded into unrecognizable confetti before being tossed into the fire. Ethan sat back on his heels, the realization chilling him more than the drafty room. This wasn't just a discarded photo. This was a ritual. He looked at the date on the back of one of the scraps. It was dated 8 months ago. 8 months ago, his mother was still alive. She was bedridden, confused, often forgetting names and faces. Ethan had assumed her forgetfulness regarding him was the disease. He remembered visiting her, sitting by her bedside and seeing her look at him with a vacant, sometimes fearful expression. "Who is he?" she would ask Olivia. And Olivia, the dutiful caretaker, would smile sadly and pat her hand. "It's okay, Clara. He's just a visitor." Ethan gripped the torn photo until the edges bit into his skin. Olivia hadn't just stolen the money. She hadn't just forged the signatures. She had actively, methodically erased him from his mother's life while she was still living. She had likely removed photos of him from the room, steered conversations away from him, and perhaps even poisoned the confused mind of a dying woman against her own son. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. While he was in Nantucket, seeking solace in another woman's arms because he felt unloved at home, Olivia was here, in this room, curating his mother's reality, ensuring that when Clara Vance died, she died believing her son was a stranger, and that Olivia was the only family she had left. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Ethan stood up abruptly, shoving the charred scraps into his pocket. He turned to face the open door. Olivia stood there. She wasn't wearing the silk robe this time. She was dressed in a sharp black business suit, her hair pulled back in a severe chignon. She looked like a CEO, or perhaps an executioner. "You're getting soot on the rug, Ethan," she said, her voice devoid of inflection. "I found the photo," Ethan said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "The one from Christmas. You burned it." Olivia didn't blink. She walked into the room inspecting her manicured nails. "I was decluttering. Clara found looking at you distressing. Toward the end, she said you reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place. I thought it was kinder to remove the confusion." "You erased me," he stepped closer, towering over her. "You manipulated a woman with dementia into forgetting her own son so you could justify taking her money." Olivia finally looked up, her dark eyes flashing with a cold, hard brilliance. "I didn't have to erase you, Ethan. You were never here. You were at the office. You were at the club. You were in Nantucket." She took a step closer to him, invading his personal space. "I held her hand when she screamed at night. I cleaned her when she couldn't make it to the bathroom. I was the daughter she actually needed. You were just the disappointment she was stuck with." Her words struck with the precision of a scalpel. They were half-truths, twisted to inflict maximum damage. "That doesn't explain the signatures, Olivia," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Or the text message you sent me. You're trying to blackmail me into settling." Olivia smiled, a thin, predatory curve of her lips. "I'm not blackmailing you. I'm negotiating. And regarding the signatures, well, memory is a fickle thing in court, but photographs of a husband cheating on his grieving wife while she tends to his dying mother? That creates a very clear narrative." She turned to leave, pausing at the threshold. "The hearing is in 2 days, Ethan. I'd suggest you think about how much your reputation is worth. Because once I release those photos, there won't be enough of it left to salvage." Ethan watched her walk away, the click of her heels echoing like gunshots in the empty house. He reached into his pocket and touched the jagged edge of the torn photo. She thought she had won. She thought the narrative was hers to control, but she had made a mistake. By keeping the photo of his mother, even while destroying the image of him, she had proven that she knew exactly who was in the picture. She hadn't forgotten him. She had targeted him. And in the pile of ash, Ethan realized there might be more than just photos. There might be the remnants of the truth his mother had tried to leave behind. He turned back to the fireplace, not to clean it, but to dig deeper. Ethan left the sitting room, the charred edges of the photograph burning a hole in his pocket, and crossed the grand foyer. The house felt immense, a mausoleum of silence that amplified the sound of his own breathing. He headed straight for the east wing, toward the heavy oak doors of his mother's private study. For 12 months, he had treated this room like a radioactive zone, terrified that the scent of her perfume or the sight of her unfinished correspondence would break him. Now he realized that his avoidance had been Olivia's greatest asset. He pushed the doors open. The air inside was still and frigid, the heating vents likely closed off to save money. Another one of Olivia's petty efficiencies. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with first editions in architectural monographs. In the center sat the massive mahogany desk, a piece of furniture that had intimidated him as a child and now looked like a lonely island in the gloom. Ethan didn't bother turning on the overhead chandelier. He switched on the green banker's lamp on the desk, casting a pool of emerald light onto the leather surface. He began to search. He started with the obvious places, the top drawers, the filing cabinets. Everything was meticulously organized, too organized. Bank statements were filed chronologically. Medical records were sorted by specialists. It was the work of a secretary, not a dying woman. This was Olivia's order, imposed on Clara's chaos. He pulled out the bottom drawer of the desk, which stuck slightly. Tugging it harder, it gave way with a wooden shriek. Inside, unlike the upper drawers, there was a mess of papers. He rifled through them and froze. There was a stack of envelopes bound by a rubber band. He recognized the stationery. It was his own. They were the letters he had written to his mother from Nantucket, and later from his business trips to London and Dubai during her final months. Short notes, updates on projects, attempts to bridge the gap caused by his physical absence. Thinking of you, Mother. Hope the new medication helps. Every single one of them was unopened. Ethan felt a constriction in his throat. He had assumed she was too weak to reply, or perhaps too angry at his perceived neglect. The truth was simpler and far more cruel. She had never received them. Olivia had intercepted his attempts at connection, ensuring that Clara Vance died believing her son had gone silent. Beneath the stack of letters lay a series of leather-bound journals. His mother had journaled religiously for decades, a habit she claimed kept her mind sharp. Ethan opened the most recent one, dated the year of her death. The handwriting at the beginning was firm and elegant. January 14th. Olivia suggests I move to the downstairs suite. She says the stairs are dangerous. I feel fine, but she insists. She is very attentive, perhaps too much so. He flipped forward 3 months. The script became shakier, the ink blotted. April 3rd. I asked for my phone today. Olivia said it was broken. I asked her to call Ethan at the office. She came back later and said he was in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed. He is always in a meeting. Why doesn't he come? Ethan gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. He hadn't been in a meeting. He had been waiting for a call that never came. He flipped to the final entries, written weeks before the end. The handwriting was jagged, almost illegible, the scrawl of a mind under siege. November 20th. The pills she gives me make the room spin. I told her I didn't want them. She said I was being difficult. She told me if I don't sign the papers, the secret will get out. She knows. God help me, she knows about the lineage. She stood by the window and told me she would burn Ethan's name to the ground if I didn't give her the power. I signed. I had to save him. Ethan stopped reading. The silence of the room roared in his ears. The lineage. He frantically searched the drawer for anything else, pulling the drawer completely out of its runner. He felt around the cavity of the desk, his fingers brushing against the rough wood of the frame. Nothing. He looked at the desktop again. There was an antique pen box, inlaid with mother of pearl, that his mother had cherished. He opened it. It was empty, save for dried ink stains. But the velvet lining at the bottom looked slightly uneven. Ethan used a letter opener to pry the edge of the velvet up. Beneath the lining was a thin, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with wax, stamped with the Vance crest, but the wax was cracked, as if it had been pressed in haste. On the front, in a handwriting that looked terrified but determined, were the words, "For Ethan. Read when necessary." Ethan's hands trembled as he broke the seal. He pulled out a single sheet of onion skin paper. "My dearest Ethan, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have finally seen through the fog she has cast over this house. Forgive me for my weakness. I was old and I was frightened, not of dying, but of what she would do to you. Olivia is not just greedy, Ethan. She is a predator who smelled blood in the water. She discovered the one thing I have spent 40 years hiding. She found the adoption papers from the chaotic years in Paris before your father and I returned to Boston." Ethan's breath hitched. "You are a Vance in spirit and heart, my son, but not by blood. Your father, my husband, was sterile. We were desperate. We adopted you in France, legally, but we buried the records to protect the estate from your uncles, who would have challenged your right to inherit the heritage. The trust explicitly states that the estate must pass to biological issue. Olivia found the old French records in the attic. She threatened to release them to the board of trustees and the press. She threatened to strip you of your name, your company, and your home. She told me that if I gave her control of my finances now, she would keep your secret safe after I died. I signed everything to protect you. I thought I was buying your safety, but I fear I have only bought a delay. Do not let her hold this over you. There is a recording, Ethan. I hid a dictaphone in the grandfather clock in the hall. It recorded her threats on the night of November 22nd. It proves coercion. It proves extortion. It may not save the money, but it will send her to prison. You are my son. Blood does not make a family. Love does. Do not let her take who you are. Love, Mother." Ethan lowered the letter. The world tilted on its axis. The revelation washed over him. The shock of his parentage, the immense weight of his mother's sacrifice, and the sickening clarity of Olivia's game. He wasn't the biological heir. Olivia held a weapon that could nuke his entire identity and strip him of everything he thought he owned. If he fought her, she would reveal he was adopted, triggering the biological issue clause in the 1920s family trust, effectively evicting him from the heritage and potentially his own company. She had played a perfect game. She knew he would fight for the estate, and she knew she had the trump card to ensure he lost it the moment he tried, but she didn't know about the dictaphone. Ethan stood up. The letter crunched in his fist. He looked at the door. The grandfather clock in the foyer was just outside. He had a choice. If he retrieved that recording, he could prove Olivia committed elder abuse and extortion. But to use it in court, he might have to expose the very secret his mother died to protect. He walked out of the study, moving not with the heavy tread of a defeated man, but with the silent, lethal purpose of a hunter. He wasn't fighting for an inheritance anymore. He was fighting for retribution. The city of Boston was waking up under a shroud of wet, heavy snow, turning the streets into gray slush. But inside Victoria Sterling's office, time seemed suspended. The only light came from the desk lamp, illuminating the jagged, terrified handwriting of a dead woman. Ethan sat in the leather wingback chair, his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He had not slept. The revelation of his adoption still hummed in his veins like a low-voltage shock, changing the molecular structure of who he thought he was. But survival instinct had taken over. He had driven straight to Victoria's townhouse at 5 a.m., waking her up with the desperation of a man whose house was on fire. Victoria finished reading the letter. She placed it gently on the desk, treating the onion skin paper with the reverence due a bomb. She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "The adoption," she said softly. "It's a nuclear option, Ethan. If she leaks this, she triggers the trust's exclusion clause. You lose the heritage because you aren't blood issue. She knows that if she reveals it, nobody wins. The estate goes to distant cousins in Virginia. She's using it solely to force you to settle. It's mutually assured destruction." Ethan looked up, his eyes rimmed with red. "There's something else I need to tell you, something she's holding over me personally." Victoria poured 2 coffees from a silver carafe. "Tell me. Nothing surprises me before 8 a.m. anymore." "I had an affair," Ethan said. The words tasted like ash. Last year, with the architect in Nantucket. It wasn't just a fling, Victoria. I was involved, and Olivia knows. She has photos. She sent me one last night. He waited for the recrimination, for the look of disappointment his mother used to give him. But Victoria simply took a sip of coffee, her expression unreadable. Infidelity is messy, Ethan. It's ugly. The tabloids will feast on it, and the judge will frown upon it, she said, her voice steady. But in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we are an equitable distribution state. Adultery is a factor, yes, but it is rarely the guillotine for asset division. It doesn't automatically grant her $80 million. It just makes you look like a bad husband, not a criminal. She leaned forward, tapping the letter. But this, extortion, elder abuse, this is criminal. Your mother's letter changes the battlefield. Ethan reached for the second page of the letter, the part he had read in the car under the streetlights, the part that hurt differently than the adoption news. Read the bottom paragraph, Ethan said, about the warning. Victoria picked up the sheet again. Her eyes scanned the text, her brow furrowing as she read aloud, her voice quiet. I tried to tell you, Ethan, before the wedding. Do you remember? I told you there was something hollow about her, something missing behind the eyes. I had Mr. Henderson look into her past in Revere, not because of her poverty, but because of her volatility. She was institutionalized twice in her 20s. Personality disorders. Narcissistic tendencies coupled with bouts of dissociation. She hides it well, masking it with ambition and poise. But when I tried to show you the medical summaries, you threw them in the fire. You told me I was being a snob. You told me I was jealous. Ethan closed his eyes, the memory surfacing through the fog of years. He remembered that fight. He remembered accusing his mother of elitism, of hating Olivia simply because she wasn't a Cabot or a Lowell. He had been so desperate to defend his choice, to prove his independence, that he had blinded himself to the red flags. I enabled her, Ethan whispered. I opened the door and let her in. You were in love, or you thought you were, Victoria said dismissively. And she is a master mimic. People with her pathology are often chameleons. They mirror what you want to see until they have what they want. Victoria flipped to the final page of the letter. Her finger traced a specific line. But this is what we can use. The pathology is hearsay without current medical records, which are privileged. But this detail is forensic. Ethan looked at where she was pointing. She practiced, Ethan. Weeks before the big transfers, I found a document in the wastebasket. It was a minor authorization, a transfer of $500 to a landscaper we haven't used in years. But the signature wasn't hers. It was mine. It was shaky, imperfect. A trial run. She was testing the bank's scrutiny. If you find that document or the record of that transfer, you have her on forgery. It proves premeditation. Victoria looked up, a shark-like glint returning to her eyes. A $500 transfer. It's insignificant money. The bank wouldn't flag it. The auditors wouldn't care. Why does it matter then? Ethan asked. Because of the date, Victoria said, pulling her laptop open. If we can find this transaction and prove it happened before your mother was incapacitated, but the signature is a forgery, it establishes a pattern of fraud. It proves she was testing the security systems. It dismantles her defense that she only took control when your mother became incompetent. It proves she was planning the takeover while your mother was still lucid. Victoria began typing furiously. I need access to the archived petty cash accounts, the ones that don't go through the main trust. Ethan watched her, feeling a strange mix of relief and nausea. They were building a case on the ashes of his family's privacy. Every defense required exposing another layer of his mother's pain or his own shame. What if she releases the adoption papers? Ethan asked, the fear still coiled in his gut. If we corner her, she'll burn it all down. I'll lose the name. I'll be nobody. Victoria stopped typing. She looked at him, her gaze softening for the first time. Ethan, look at me. You built that company. You restored the heritage. You cared for Clara in your own way, flawed as it was. A piece of paper in a French archive doesn't change who sat by her bedside or who she tried to protect with her dying breath. Olivia thinks the name Vance is a currency. You know it's a responsibility. She turned the laptop screen toward him. A spreadsheet was loading. Let her try to burn it down, Victoria said. We're going to make sure she's holding the match when the gas leaks. The screen populated. Victoria filtered the search. November the 2nd, a transfer of 500 wooers to Greenleaf Landscaping. Got it, Victoria whispered. Now we just need the physical check. Banks digitize everything now. But if this was a physical check deposited via mobile app, the image is stored. She clicked a file. An image of a check appeared on the screen. The signature at the bottom read, Clara Vance. But it was wrong. The V looped to the left. Clara Vance, educated in Swiss boarding schools, had always looped her V to the right. It was a subtle, almost invisible difference. But to a son and to a forensic handwriting expert, it was a smoking gun. It's a forgery, Ethan said, his voice firm. That's not her hand. No, Victoria agreed, hitting the print button. It's a rehearsal. Ethan stood up. The weight on his chest hadn't lifted, but it had shifted. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was a man with a weapon. We need the dictaphone, Ethan said. The letter mentioned a recording. If we have this check and we have her voice-threatening mother, then we don't just win the divorce, Victoria finished, handing him the freshly printed image. We send her to federal prison. Ethan took the paper. I'm going back to the house. If the clock hasn't been moved, the tape is still there. Be careful, Ethan, Victoria warned. She knows you're up to something. A narcissist losing control is the most dangerous thing in the world. Ethan nodded and walked out into the snow. He drove back toward the North Shore, the wiper blades beating a rhythm against the windshield. The clock, the clock, the clock. He had to get to the hallway before Olivia realized that the silence of the house was no longer empty, but filling with the echoes of her own crimes. The drive back to the North Shore was a navigation through a white void. The snow had thickened into a blizzard, erasing the coastline and reducing the world to the sweep of wiper blades and the hum of the heater. Ethan felt a strange, vibrating clarity. The fear that had paralyzed him for days, the fear of public shame, of losing the estate, of facing his own reflection, had evaporated, replaced by the cold mechanical purpose of an executioner. He pulled the Range Rover up to the front steps of the Heritage. The house loomed in the gray light, its stone facade looking less like a home and more like a fortress that had been breached from within. Ethan entered through the main doors, stomping the snow from his boots. The sound echoed through the cavernous foyer, sharp and intrusive. He didn't take off his coat. He walked straight toward the grandfather clock that stood beneath the spiraling staircase. It was a towering piece of 18th century craftsmanship, its pendulum swinging with a slow, heavy rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat slowing down. He reached for the small access panel on the side of the clock's waist, usually reserved for winding the weights. It's not there. The voice came from the shadows of the upper landing. Ethan froze, his hand hovering over the wood. He looked up. Olivia stood at the top of the stairs. She looked uncharacteristically disheveled. Her hair, usually sprayed into architectural submission, hung loose around her shoulders. She was wearing a cashmere sweater that belonged to him, the sleeves bunching around her wrists, making her look smaller, younger, and infinitely more fragile. I found it 3 days after the funeral, she said, her voice drifting down like dust. Your mother was clever, hiding a dictaphone in the one object in the house that makes enough noise to mask a recording. But she wasn't clever enough. Ethan slowly withdrew his hand. The tactical advantage he thought he had, the smoking gun of the audio recording, was gone. But he touched the pocket of his coat, feeling the folded printout of the forged check. He still had ammunition. Where is it, Olivia? Ethan asked, his tone conversational, almost bored. Destroyed, obviously. She began to descend the stairs, her hand gripping the banister so hard her knuckles turned white. Just like I destroyed the photos of you. Just like I'm trying to destroy the evidence of your incompetence so we can keep this life. This isn't a life, Ethan said, watching her approach. It's a hostage situation. She stopped on the bottom step, eye level with him. The mask of the Boston socialite had slipped completely. In the harsh winter light filtering through the transom windows, he didn't see the formidable Mrs. Vance. He saw the girl from Revere, who had clawed her way out of a basement apartment, terrified that the floor would fall out from under her at any moment. "You don't get it," she whispered, her eyes shimmering with a frantic, wet heat. "You've never had to worry about heating bills, Ethan. You've never had to choose between rent and groceries. You think I'm greedy? No, I'm terrified. I promised myself I would never go back to that. I did what I had to do to secure us." She reached out, her fingers grazing the lapel of his damp coat. It was a gesture of intimacy that felt grotesque in the context of their war. "Clara was going to give away chunks of the liquid assets to charity," Olivia pleaded, her voice pitching up. "She wasn't thinking clearly. I forged the check to test the account, yes, to see if I could stop the bleeding if she decided to donate the endowment to some cat shelter. I did it to protect the estate, to protect you." Ethan looked down at her hand. 10 years ago, that touch would have disarmed him. Now he felt nothing but a distant, clinical pity. "You didn't do it for me," he said, stepping back, forcing her hand to drop. "You did it because you're a narcissist who can't distinguish between love and possession. You isolated a dying woman because you were jealous of her power. You wanted to be the matriarch before the seat was even empty." "And what about you?" Olivia snapped, the vulnerability hardening instantly into rage. "You checked out years ago. You think you're the victim? You left me alone in this mausoleum while you played house with your little architect in Nantucket. You broke the vows first, Ethan." The mention of Clara, the architect, triggered a realization in Ethan that hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had spent months hating himself for the affair. He had drowned in guilt, believing he was a weak man who had succumbed to temptation. But standing here, looking at the woman who had methodically erased his existence from his mother's life, he understood the true nature of his infidelity. It hadn't been about sex. It hadn't even been about love, really. "I didn't cheat on you because I was weak," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "I cheated because I was trying to blow this up. Subconsciously, I knew. I knew something was wrong in this house. I knew you were suffocating me. I couldn't leave you because of the Vance honor, so I did the one thing that would force the end. My affair wasn't a mistake, Olivia. It was an escape hatch." Olivia stared at him, her mouth slightly open. The color drained from her face. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that her emotional leverage was gone. He didn't care about the shame anymore. He had accepted his role as the villain in her story, so he could be the hero in his own. "I have the check," Ethan said, pulling the paper from his pocket. "The $500 transfer to Greenleaf Landscaping, November 2nd. The signature is a forgery. My lawyer has confirmed it doesn't match Mother's motor patterns." Olivia laughed, a brittle cracking sound. "It's $500, Ethan. No DA will prosecute that." "It establishes a timeline," he countered. "It proves you were practicing fraud while she was still lucid, and combined with Mother's letter about your history of personality disorders, which I will petition the court to unseal, it paints a picture of predatory behavior. I don't need to win a criminal case. I just need to show this to the judge in family court. The widowed wife narrative dies the second I submit this." "You can't," she hissed, stepping closer again, her eyes wide with panic. "If you do that, I release the adoption papers. You lose the name. You lose the trust." "Do it," Ethan said. The two words hung in the air, sucking the oxygen out of the foyer. Olivia froze. "I don't care about the money anymore," Ethan lied. He cared about the house, but he knew he had to be willing to lose it to save it. "I don't care if the whole of Boston knows I'm adopted. In fact, it might be freeing. But you care about the reputation. You care about the lunch invitations and the charity galas. If I expose you as an elder abuser, you won't just be poor, Olivia. You'll be a pariah. You'll be the woman who tortured a dying philanthropist." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You can keep the adoption papers, but I'm submitting the medical history and the forgery to the judge tomorrow morning, unless you sign the settlement tonight." Olivia trembled. The foundation of her world, the belief that Ethan was too proud to fight dirty, had crumbled. She looked at the grandfather clock, then at the paper in his hand, and finally at his eyes. There was no love left there, not even hate, just the blank, terrifying resolve of a stranger. "You're destroying me," she whispered, tears finally spilling over. real tears of defeat. "No," Ethan said, walking past her toward the library. "I'm just turning on the lights." He left her standing in the foyer, a small, diminishing figure in the vast, cold hall of the family she had tried so desperately and so violently to own. The fluorescent lights of courtroom 4B hummed with a low, insectile buzz that seemed to drill directly into Ethan's temples. Outside, the Boston winter had turned into a sleet storm, rattling the high windows, but inside the air was stagnant, smelling of floor wax and stale anxiety. Ethan sat motionless, his hands clasped on the table. Watching Olivia's lead attorney, a man named Marcus Sterling, no relation to Victoria, though they shared the same predatory grace, paced before the bench. Sterling was good. He was weaving a narrative that made the $80 million demand sound not like robbery, but like justice. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice smooth and resonant, "we have established that Mr. Vance abandoned the marital consortium long before the physical separation. While he was playing out a midlife crisis in Nantucket, my client was the sole caregiver for his dying mother. She sacrificed her career, her mental health, and her social standing to maintain the Vance legacy. To deny her the equitable share of the estate, including the marital home, the heritage, is to punish her for her loyalty." Olivia sat at the plaintiff's table, a portrait of dignified suffering. She dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief at perfect intervals. She didn't look at Ethan. She was looking at the judge, Judge Thorne, a stern man with gray temples and a reputation for hating wasted time. Victoria leaned in close to Ethan, her whisper sharp. "He's landing punches, Ethan." The judge is nodding. "When I stand up, I'm going to pivot to the premarital asset separation. It's dry, but it's our best shield." Ethan looked at the folder in front of him. Inside lay the onion skin letter from his mother in the printout of the forged check. He felt a strange calmness settle over him, the kind of clarity that comes only when you realize there is no way back. "No," Ethan said quietly. Victoria froze. "Excuse me? You're arguing numbers, Victoria. This isn't about math. It's about character." Before Victoria could clamp a hand on his arm to stop him, Ethan stood up. The movement was sudden enough that it broke the rhythm of the room. Sterling stopped mid-sentence. Judge Thorne looked over his spectacles, his eyebrows knitting together. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice gravelly, "you have counsel. It is generally wise to let her speak for you." "With respect, Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice steady, projecting to the back of the room where a few court reporters were scribbling furiously. "There is one document that has not been entered into evidence. My lawyer advised against it because of evidentiary rules regarding hearsay, but this court is a court of equity, tasked with finding the truth of the marriage, not just the balance of the bank accounts." "Objection," Sterling barked, stepping forward. "Ambush tactics. We haven't seen this document." "Overruled for the moment," Judge Thorne said, leaning back. "I'm curious. Proceed, Mr. Vance, but be brief." Ethan walked to the bench. He didn't look at Olivia, but he could feel her gaze burning into the side of his face. He placed the letter on the judge's dais. "This is a letter written by my mother, Clara Vance, 2 weeks before her death," Ethan said. "It was sealed in her desk, marked to be opened only in the event of a legal dispute regarding her estate." "This is inadmissible," Sterling shouted, losing his cool. "It's a dead woman's unverified writing. We can't cross-examine her." "You can't cross-examine her because she was isolated and medicated into silence?" Ethan cut in, his voice rising, hard and cold. "Read the second paragraph." "Your Honor." The judge picked up the delicate paper. The room went silent, save for the sleet hitting the glass. Ethan watched the judge's eyes scan the page. He saw the moment the judge hit the part about the destroyed prenuptial agreement. "My mother details how Olivia found the original copy of our prenuptial agreement, the one that specifically excluded the heritage from any marital division, and burned it in the library fireplace," Ethan stated. "She witnessed it. She was too afraid to speak because Olivia threatened to put her in a state-run facility." Olivia stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "That is a lie, a vicious, desperate lie." "Sit down, Mrs. Vance," Judge Thorne snapped, not looking up from the letter. Ethan continued, relentless. "But that isn't the only thing she destroyed. The letter also details a practice of forgery, Attached is a copy of a check for $500, signed by Clara Vance on November 2nd. My forensic expert has confirmed the signature does not match my mother's motor control capabilities at that stage of her illness. It matches Olivia's handwriting style. Sterling was objecting again, citing chain of custody, citing relevance. But the energy in the room had shifted. The narrative of the grieving widow was dissolving under the weight of the specific, ugly details. And finally, Ethan said, delivering the blow he had prepared for the last 48 hours. My mother writes about a recording. He turned to look at Olivia. She was pale, her skin the color of old parchment. Her hands were gripping the table so hard her knuckles were blue. She mentions a dictaphone hidden in the grandfather clock in the main hall, Ethan said, lying by omission. He didn't have the tape. Olivia had destroyed it. But Olivia didn't know that the letter didn't contain the tape. She only knew the tape had existed. She recorded a conversation on the night of November 22nd, a conversation where Olivia explicitly threatened to withhold pain medication unless power of attorney was signed. Your Honor, Sterling screamed. This is outrageous. Where is this alleged recording? The investigation will find it, Ethan lied smoothly, holding Olivia's gaze. Unless, of course, it was recently removed by the only other person who lives in the house. Judge Thorne lowered the letter. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he looked at Olivia, there was no longer sympathy in his expression. There was the cold, hard scrutiny of the law. Mrs. Vance, the judge said softly, did you have access to Clara Vance's personal correspondence? I managed her mail. She was confused, Olivia stammered. Her poise was gone. She looked cornered, small, and guilty. And the prenuptial agreement? The judge asked. Mr. Sterling claimed in his opening statement that no such document ever existed. It didn't. I mean, I never saw one. Your mother's letter is very specific, Mr. Vance, the judge said, turning back to Ethan. She cites the name of the attorney who drafted the lost prenup, a Mr. Henderson, retired now, I believe. He is, Ethan confirmed, and he is willing to testify that he drafted it, even if the signed copy is missing. Judge Thorne stacked the papers together. He picked up his gavel. Mr. Sterling, your request for a summary judgment on the assets is denied. The gavel banged, a sharp crack like a gunshot. This court is pausing the divorce proceedings. Given the serious nature of the allegations contained in this document, specifically regarding elder abuse, forgery, and the spoliation of evidence, I am ordering a court-appointed forensic accountant to audit every transaction made by Mrs. Vance in the last 24 months. Furthermore, I am appointing a guardian ad litem to review Clara Vance's medical records and interview the staff regarding Mrs. Vance's conduct. Your Honor, this will drag on for months, Sterling protested. Then I suggest you get comfortable, Judge Thorne replied, because if these allegations are substantiated, we won't be in family court. We'll be in criminal court. The judge stood up and swept out of the room. Ethan remained standing. He felt Victoria's hand on his shoulder, squeezing tight in victory, but he didn't smile. He looked across the aisle. Olivia had collapsed into her chair, her face buried in her hands, her lawyer frantically whispering damage control into her ear. She looked up, catching Ethan's eye through the gap in her fingers. There was hatred there, yes, but mostly there was fear. The fear of the girl from Revere who realized the floor had finally fallen out. Ethan turned and walked toward the exit. He hadn't won the money yet, but he had done something more important. He had told the truth, and for the first time in 10 years, the truth had actually mattered. The settlement was signed not in a courtroom, but in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of a mediating firm on State Street. There was no gavel banging, no dramatic reading of a verdict. There was only the soft, scratching sound of a pen moving across paper and the hum of the climate control system. Ethan watched from the end of the long table as Olivia affixed her signature to the final page. She looked smaller than he had ever seen her. The vibrant, combative woman who had stormed the stairs of the Heritage just days ago had been replaced by someone gray and diminished. The threat of a criminal investigation for forgery and elder abuse had done what no emotional plea could. It had broken her leverage. Under the terms of the agreement, she received $2 million, a fraction of the $80 million she had demanded. Barely enough to buy a condo in the seaport, let alone maintain her social climbing. In exchange, she vacated all claims to the heritage, the Vance Trust, and, most significantly, the Vance name. She would revert to Olivia Dubois. She capped the pen and slid the document across the table. She didn't look at Ethan. She looked at the space between them, a chasm filled with 10 years of silence and 1 week of brutal noise. "It's done," Victoria Sterling said, collecting the papers with efficient, professional finality. Olivia stood up. She smoothed her skirt, a reflex of old habits, but her hands were trembling. She finally looked at Ethan. Her eyes were dry, void of the anger that had fueled her for so long. "You think you won," she said softly. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation. "No," Ethan replied, his voice raspy. "I just stopped losing." She turned and walked out. Ethan watched her go, feeling not the surge of triumph he had expected, but a dull, hollow ache in the center of his chest. 2 hours later, Ethan stood in the foyer of the Heritage. The house was theirs, his again. The staff had been dismissed for the weekend. It was just him in the echoing silence of 4 generations. Olivia's departure had been swift. Her personal effects had been packed by movers while they were at the lawyer's office. The house felt lighter, yet strangely larger, as if the walls had expanded to emphasize his solitude. He walked through the rooms, his footsteps sharp against the hardwood. The library, the dining room, the sunroom, they were all perfectly preserved, museum-quality spaces that felt utterly devoid of life. He ended up in the library, pouring a glass of scotch he didn't really want. He sat in the leather armchair, the same one where he had first confronted Olivia about the divorce. The fire was dying in the grate, reducing to glowing embers. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out 2 items. The first was the grainy photograph of him and Clara, the architect, walking on the beach in Nantucket, the blackmail material Olivia had sent him. The second was the torn scrap of the family Christmas photo he had retrieved from the ashes, the one where Olivia had ripped his image away from his mother. He looked at the photo of himself with Clara. He remembered the salt air, the smell of sawdust, and the illusion of escape. He had convinced himself that his affair was a noble rebellion against a toxic marriage. But sitting here now, in the wreckage of his life, he saw it for what it was: cowardice. He hadn't tried to fix the marriage, nor had he ended it with dignity. He had simply looked for a soft place to land while his house burned down. He had used Clara just as Olivia had used him, to fill a void. He tossed the blackmail photo into the fire. The edges curled, the image of the beach bubbling and turning black before disappearing into flame. Next, he looked at the torn family photo, his mother's smiling face, oblivious to the tear that separated her from her son. He thought about the letter she had written, the secret of his adoption she had carried to her grave to protect him. He wasn't a Vance by blood. He was a Vance by love, and by the terrible, messy sacrifices people make to hold on to what they cherish. He realized he had spent his whole life trying to live up to a name that wasn't genetically his, while Olivia had spent hers trying to steal a name she didn't earn. They were both imposters, in their own ways, driven by a desperate need to belong to something bigger than themselves. He threw the torn scrap into the fire. He watched it burn until there was nothing left but gray ash, mingling with the soot of the old logs. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty room. He wasn't sure who he was apologizing to: his mother, Olivia, or the version of himself he had lost somewhere between the ambition and the lies. The anger was gone. The resentment toward Olivia had evaporated, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. She was just a tragedy now, a footnote in the history of the house. And he was the survivor. But survivors are often just the ones left to clean up the mess. Ethan stood up and walked to the French doors overlooking the grounds. The blizzard that had raged for days had finally ceased. The sky was a bruised purple, clearing toward the west where a sliver of pale winter sun was breaking through the clouds. The snow covered everything in a pristine white blanket, hiding the scars of the land, smoothing over the rough edges of the world. It was beautiful. It was cold. It was silent. He placed his hand against the glass, feeling the chill seep into his palm. He was 45 years old. He was alone. He had a fortune, a mansion, and a legacy that was built on secrets. But as he looked out at the stillness of the frozen marshes, he felt the first true breath of air fill his lungs in years. There were no more lies to tell, no more performances to act out. The house was empty, but it was clean. Ethan turned away from the window, leaving the view of the snow behind. He walked back toward the desk, turned on the small lamp, and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. He didn't know what he was going to write or who he would write to. Maybe to Clara, the architect, to apologize. Maybe to himself. It didn't matter. The ink was fresh, the page was white, and for the first time, the story was his to write.